I'm very happy and excited for today's guest. He's a distinguished professor and researcher at the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias, a PhD and doctorate background in astrophysics with the emphasis on astroseismology, a world-renowned specialist in exoplanetary and archaeoastronomy, vice president of the C4 World Heritage and Astronomy Commission with the IAU. He was honored with the Carlos Jacek Award for his work in cultural astronomy. In addition, he is the author of a plethora of well-sought-after books, articles, and publications. Professor Dr. Juan Antonio Belmonte, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Hello. Good evening.
Good evening. So, the first question, I want to connect to a recent topic. And on the 21st December last year, there was an event where Jupiter and Saturn, the planets, they came very close to each other on their orbits. And not on their orbits, but on their ellipses. And
Yes.
it was called a conjunction point. And now if you look into the internet, then some were giving this event the name a winter star because they came so close to each other that they almost were visible as only one point of light. And if you dig a little bit deeper, there were some theories connecting this event to the Star of Bethlehem. Now, my question to you is, would that be a job for an archaeoastronomer?
Well, in some sense, yes. Actually, there has been historians of astronomy who have been asking themselves for decades what could be the origin of the legend of the Star of Bethlehem and if it has any real meaning from the astronomical point of view. So a few years ago, let's say a couple of decades, there were a few publications which argued that the Star of Bethlehem was actually the conjunction between the two major planets of the solar system, so Jupiter and Saturn. Actually, one of my colleagues at the IAC, who is now working in Madrid, in ISA, Mark Kidger, even made a book on that topic. So the idea has been going around for decades already. So this was in some way reenacted because of the conjunction that happened this year, you see? Because it was really striking. I mean, it also happens close to the solstice, which, as you know, has a very important cultural connection with several ancient cultures and several religions. So it was a pretty nice question to face during the last conjunction. Yes, actually, yes. It can be the work or a historian of astronomy or an archaeoastronomer, as you wish.
You've hinted that most of those theories that they are circulating for a little while now. And the field of archaeoastronomy itself, is it a very young science, or was it always there and was just emerging now as an own discipline?
Well, we always mention that the birth of archaeoastronomy was possibly at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when a few scholars started to measure the orientation of some Greek temples and also Egyptian temples. For example, Sir Norman Lockyer, who is famous because he was the discoverer of helium in the sun, and also the founder of the journal Nature, produced a book which is called The Dawn of Astronomy, where he studied ancient Egyptian religion and the orientation of the temples in relationship to all the ancient Egyptian civilization. The problem was that most of the ideas that he proposed were strongly rejected by Egyptologists of his time. Some of them were even wrong. So this means that for decades, this starting discipline was forgotten until at the end of the 20th century, in the 80s and 90s, the discipline, let's say, was restarted by a series of scholars very well reputed today as the parents of archaeoastronomy, let's say, like Michael Hoskin, Clive Ruggles, Gerald Hawkins, who made the work in Stonehenge that was quite controversial in its times. So it is not, I would not say it is a young discipline. What is young is the sense that it is taken in the last few years, where the relationship between astronomy and archaeology, or let's say landscape and skyscape, is stronger than ever, because archaeologists has noticed that it can be as important to look at the land as to look at the sky, you see. So in some sense, there is even a new journal, which is quite young, just 5 or 6 years, which is called Skyscape Archaeology. So in some way, archaeoastronomy is now in blossom in many aspects. The problem is that it has a distorting starting during the last century. But I think that in the last decades, the effort of many people has managed to establish this kind of studies as a real interdisciplinary science.
Now you've mentioned that there's this term of skyscapes, and do you sometimes have the feeling that the language of this discipline is still building, that you are sometimes not having the right word to describe connections or complex mechanisms that you know they're there, but you haven't found the right language yet to describe?
Well, actually, I think we have. What we normally use now is neither is not archaeoastronomy. We speak about cultural astronomy, in the sense that what we are doing is studying how astronomy has been related to cultures throughout history. In the past, in which case you call it archaeoastronomy, or even in recent times, in which case you call it ethnoastronomy. I mean, even modern cosmology in some way would enter that field of cultural astronomy, because we astronomers are probably the largest generators of metaphysics right now in the world. So, and this has been for the whole history, you see. People look at the skyscape from the very beginning, and they didn't make distinctions in what they observe in the land, I mean mountains, or what they observe in the sky. And for them, it was as important as a mountain as a seat of the gods, as the mountain as a reference point, for example, to observe an important sunrise or sunset that was somehow connected with the gods. So cultural astronomy, in that sense, we need to make to produce this composite word with an adjective and a proper name to exactly describe our discipline. Although I have no problem at all to being called an archaeoastronomer, I would prefer to be mentioned as a cultural astronomer. But both terms sometimes can be taken as synonymous, you see.
So when you are doing research and starting with a new proposal, and you say that the land itself is as important as the sky, as a cultural astronomer, how would you start if you are approaching a question in this field? Do you try to get field time and stand there and then look at the world, and how you start with the stuff like that?
As my former PhD student, Andrea Rodriguez Anton, mentioned in her PhD and in a paper she published later on, nothing compares to fieldwork. I mean, to be on the terrain, to measure directly what the orientation of the structures you are studying. In the real landscape, there is no parallelism about it. I mean, this is something, actually, after 1 year of pandemics without fieldwork, I feel somehow like in a jail, you see?
Yeah.
We should have made fieldwork last year at least 2 campaigns. We couldn't afford that.
Mm-hmm.
So in principle, yes, fieldwork is primordial and at the same time a privilege. Of course, it depends a lot on the culture you are going to study. For example, if you are studying the megalithic phenomena, you don't have text to deal with. So you must basically look at the land and the skyscape related to the megalithic monuments. When you study, for example, Egypt or the Hittites, you have the text. And then you should also look at these texts to have the whole picture of what you are studying. So it depends also on which kind of research you are doing, the approach that you use to finally deal with the cultural astronomical aspect of a certain society.
Now, you have done a lot of research on the statisticals on the orientation of structures, as well as in Egypt. Now, let's step for one moment away from temples and from pyramids, but only talk about the monolithic or megalithic ancient sites. Is there always a connection to the sky, or are there sometimes just tombs and they were not focused on the sky in any connection?
Well, the answer to that question would be yes and no. I mean, one advantage of megalithic monuments is that of a certain kind, usually you have a lot of them, you see? So you can produce statistical studies. Despite of the fact that you don't have text and the archaeology is sometimes very limited, you have a long series of monuments that you can study. For example, in the western facade of the Iberian Peninsula, there is a large connections of dolmens, which are called antas alentejanas. Antas is the name in Portuguese for dolmen, and the Alentejo is a region of Portugal, but actually this kind of antas were built from the Algarve in the south to Galicia in the north of the Iberian Peninsula. Well, all of them, without a single exception, do face sunrise at some moment of the year. This is impossible that it is by chance. I mean, it is virtually impossible. Also, for example, there are tiny objects that were found in these dolmens, which are called plaque idols. These are plaques of schist with representations that they apparently represent a sort of old goddess or god. And the decoration is normally triangles or squares or lines, and you can count them, okay? This we did, and we found that the numbers which are more repeated in these small objects is a number between 29 and 30 and between 12 and 13. Both of them are astronomical numbers. 12, 13 is the number of lunations in a tropical year, 2930 is the number of days within a lunation. So for certain, these people were observing the sky. This doesn't mean that every megalithic monument in the world must include an astronomical alignment. One thing does not oblige the other. Of course, certainly there would be exceptions, but we have enough evidence that quite a long series of monuments had a very strong astronomical relations during the megalithic and cyclopean phenomena.
Now, if you are testing for an orientation, of course, the most prominent feature is the sun, and you are going thousands of years back. Do you have to take changes into account? Is the movement of the sun over this long period changing, or is this a stable cycle for the sunrise and sunset and the solstices and so forth?
This is a very important question, because a lot of people think that precession affects the position of the moon or the sun in relationship to the Earth, which is not. Actually, the only thing that affects the position of moonrise and sunrise in past times is that the axis of the Earth, which is inclinated right now 23.5 degrees to the ecliptic, so the orbit of the Earth around the sun, has a little variation in thousands of years, between 22 and a little bit more than 24. This can move slightly the position of the solstices. For example, for you to have an idea, in 4,000 years, the changement is something like half a degree, which is nearly a full solar diameter. So this might affect actually the extreme positions of both the sun and the moon, so the solstices and the lunar phases. But the variation is very, very small. And for example, it doesn't affect at all any kind of equinox you may define. I mean, any midpoint would be nearly at the center of the arc formed by the winter and summer solstice, sunrises or sunsets. So there is an effect, and we can measure it, and we have observed it. For example, in the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, you can easily appreciate that the temple is not orientated to winter solstice sunrise today, but it was orientated to that astronomical phenomena 4,000 years ago when the temple was inaugurated. So we can see that variation in some large structures. Of course, when you go to a much smaller one, like for example, a dolmen, whichever the size of the dolmen, it is very difficult to appreciate such a difference. In Stonehenge, for example, you do appreciate it. Actually, if you go to the monument now and you go to summer solstice sunrise, you can see the sun rising on the heel stone. But the heel stone is the singular one of a pair that has survived. And this pair of stones were actually framing sunrise 3,800 years ago, when the largest structures of Stonehenge were built. So you can appreciate this phenomenon. It's not very large, but you can see it.
Now, when let's say we're getting to the winter solstice, then on some of the northern hemisphere, it dips very low to the horizon, and I've read that the closer you get to the horizon, the more errors in small precision you will make because of atmospheric effects. if we are talking about 1,000 years back, could there have been precision problems that would be worth taking into account, or are those effects so minimal that it's not a problem?
No, it is. Actually, it is. This is a very good question. One of the fathers of Archaeoastronomy in Britain in the last century was Alexander Thom. He was an engineer that studied a long series of megalithic monuments in the British Islands. And he found extraordinary precision. He even argued that he was able to observe the nutation movement of the moon. All these theories has been reassessed in the last 30 years, especially by Clive Ruggles, but also other colleagues, who now argue that it is very difficult to be such precise, precisely because of that. Because when you have the moon or the sun setting with such an inclined angle, you see, small variability due to refraction or atmospheric condition can severely alter the results. Mm-hmm. So you can be sure of an alignment with certain limitations, but you should not be sure of high astronomical precision in prehistory. This is very difficult to assess and still more difficult to demonstrate.
Mm-hmm. Now there is this speculation about what if it was possible for ancient cultures to see Venus as something else than a star. I mean, the movement, they must have recognized that it is something else than most of the stars because it has a different motion. But there is some speculation if it is possible to see the crescent forming with the visible eye or not. And is that such a thing that you only have information in modern times?
I think before the telescope, this is nearly impossible. I mean, such a good observer at Tycho Brahe, possibly the best observer ever before the telescope, he wasn't able to see Venus anything else than a point. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can notice the difference in brightness, of course. Venus brightness varies a lot depending if it is a crescent or if it is nearly a disk when it is in opposition, you see. But for him, it was impossible to distinguish that things. Mm-hmm. Actually, it was not until Galileo was able to face the sky with a telescope that this was known. So I think it is nearly impossible that any culture in the past was able to distinguish the sizes of Venus along the movement of the planets in the cycles that it produced. Of course, they knew that the morning and the evening star were the same object. Mm-hmm. The Maya knew it, the Sumerians knew it, the Greek soon learned it. At the beginning, they gave different names to the two stars, as you know. One was called Phosphorus, the other was called Hesperos. But, for example, Mayan and Sumerians, they knew perfectly from very, very early on that they were talking about the same planet. But I sincerely doubt that they were able to distinguish the crescent form from the nearly circular one. Mm-hmm.
Now there are some star constellations that always have been prominent and that always have been some sort of put together into similar images because just of how they seem to have a certain structure to it. Like, for example, the Pleiades or the Plejaden, they have been very important, I think, in the cultural development. Why is it that some star constellations have been so prominently featured, and some are just there and not nice to have, but you know?
Well, you mentioned the most important all of them, the Pleiades. I still remember one night that I went to the observatory here in Tenerife with my colleague students of hieroglyphics to try to observe Sirius zodiacal rising. And we went to the observatory a couple of hours before, and then they had no idea at all of the sky, okay? And then I asked them, please tell me what calls your attention, okay? The first object all of them signaled were the Pleiades.
Mm-hmm.
It was in the sky, it was about 30 degrees above the horizon, and it was a very clear night, very dark, and all of them mentioned that this was the most prominent object. So from that day on, I had no doubt that for every single culture where the Pleiades could be observed, would have had a close cultural relationship to it. And actually they have. The Incas have it, the Aztecs have it, the Greeks and the Romans, of course. Most of the civilizations in the world has looked at the Pleiades and has used it as a time marker. Of course, we know Hesiod, the point of the working days, where the Pleiades are the most important object related to ploughing, sowing, and harvest. This is very common to many, many cultures. Actually, I was astonished 20 years ago when we made an ethno-astronomical study here in the Canaries with the peasants of the islands. And the first object I heard was called either El Siete, which means the seven, or Las Cabrillas, which is the Castilian name for the Pleiades. It appeared actually in the Quixote of Miguel de Cervantes, you see. And for them, this was the most important astronomical object in the sky. I was really astonished about it. So the Pleiades are very relevant. Of course, after that, I asked for some other objects. And then they mentioned the Hyades. Then they mentioned the belt of Orion, or belt. Then I forced a little bit more, please tell me more. Then they found some bright stars like Vega, for example, in the sky. I forced the machine, and then looking at the north, they were able to tell me something about, well, the Big Dipper was not very, very visible from when we were, but at the end, but from the very beginning, what I noticed is that after 7 objects, there were no more. They were called. You see? So there are a lot of stars, but there are not so many stars that has had a real crucial cultural astronomical aspect.
Now, some years ago, they found something, the sky disk of Nebra, and there is a representation of the. So no, there is a discussion if there is a representation of the Pleiades on this disk, and there is also a discussion if let's say you're traversing along becoming a civilization and becoming and you need to have a calendar and you need to have a long time understanding of time, that you get a problem with the lunar cycle and the solar cycle. And is there a possibility that if you have, let's say, the Pleiades and have their cycle and their movement, for you to make a connection between lunar cycle, stellar cycle of a certain constellation, and solar cycle, and have a higher understanding of the small differences that become problematic if you're talking about?
Well, the difference is not problematic. Actually, it is one of the longest standing problem of astronomy, which is the problem of incommensurability of the tropical year and the number of lunations. You see, the tropic year has 365.2422 days today, and the moon, you can have either 12 or 30 lunations, okay? Actually, something more than 12 in a tropical year, and this has been a problem for many, many cultures. So most of the cultures, what they made was creating a lunisolar calendar, okay? Lunisolar calendar of 12, sometimes 30 months that can follow either cycles, for example, the Heptateris in Greece, or the Metonic cycle, which was used by the church for centuries to calculate the feast of Passover, Easter, I mean. But in several other cultures, they observe some astronomical phenomena to keep the path of the sun and the moon in agreement, let's say. And this could be either solar, so they could observe the solstices or the equinoxes, and some cultures use the stars, okay? Or even a geological phenomena. For example, the rising of a river, okay? But you could observe the stars if you notice that after 365 days, a certain asterism is seen again just when you get up before dawn, and you notice 1 year later that the same star or asterism is there, and then another year the same, then you can use the observation of this star and asterism as a perfect time marker to count the moons and to have a path between the lunations, which is the origin of the months, and with the year, which of course is very important because it is critical for economical activities, see? For agriculture, or even in pastoral societies, or even in hunter-gatherer societies, to be at the correct place at the adequate moment, you see? So the stars can be used also for that purpose.
Now, during our history, there was always a power shift between tribes at first, between civilizations, between empires even. Now, if, let's say, you had a very advanced astronomical knowledge for your part of the Earth, we're talking about ancient times, and now there is a power shift because there is like an invading force, and normally knowledge is a resource. It's very protective. Would it have been useful if you had an ancient times knowledge about the movements of the celestial bodies, and then some invading force takes it and is now looking at the knowledge some, let's say, 1,000 miles away, and then it doesn't match up anymore? So is it what is necessary for, or what understanding do you need to have that the observation you make on one point of the Earth is useful for you on another part of the Earth?
Well, this is a nice question also. Well, The first point is that elevated cultures that has been conquered by, let's say, no so elevated ones, normally the conquerors assume most of the ideas of the previous people, okay? For example, it is always mentioned that Rome conquered Greece by weapons, but Greek conquered Rome by culture. Actually, the constellations we recognize today in the sky were passed to us by the Romans, who at once has taken them from the Greeks, you see, who were the ones mapping the sky at some moment. Possibly they took much of the sky of previous cultures, but they were the ones that organized the sky in a mythological way so that it was easy to understand. And we still follow today that thing, okay? What happened, for example, in America, okay? When the Spanish arrived to highly civilized cultures such as the Aztecs or the Incas. Astronomical traditions of the Aztecs and the Incas survived after the conquest. Why? Because they were useful in their own countries for the people living there. For example, Colca, which is the name that the Incas give to the Pleiades, is still used by the peasants in the highlands in Peru for agriculture, or it was used until some decades ago. I don't know the situation right now, but I mean, there is a very interesting book by Gary Arton, which is called At the Crossroads of the Earth and the Sky, in which he studied the Pleiades and he studied the Milky Way and the position of the Pleiades and the Milky Way in relation to the agriculture. So when the Spanish arrived, they imposed religion, but the astronomical traditions that were behind by the people survived, okay? Of course, some of the Spanish ones were also included. For example, the solstice, that we call it Christmas. Now it is important there, which possibly was not important during Inca's time, because the solstices are not so clear in the close to the equator, you see. So normally there is a mixture of ancient and new traditions when you find these things. I can go back to the Canaries. In this ethno-astronomical work that I mentioned we were able to find traditions coming from the mainland, so probably with the European colonizers, but there are also traditions that probably are a relict of the Aboriginal population of the island. So this is quite general. I mean, it is difficult to fully obliterate the previous traditions. Another example, for example, is the expansion of Islam. Islam expanded with a purely lunar calendar, okay? Which is useless for economical purposes, okay? Because it only counts lunations, one after the other, okay? And this has no purpose or using in economic, especially in an agricultural community. So this means that the Coptic calendar in Egypt, the Julian calendar in Al-Maghrib, or the previous Babylonian calendar in the Middle East have survived to the Islamization. Why? Because they were useful for the people to keep using them for various purposes, you see?
Now, of course, the knowledge about the skies and the celestials until today is very important for navigation, and has become much more when the seafaring really caught on. And you said that the usefulness of the information you get from the knowledge that you have about the stars. Was navigation in, let's say, 2000, 3000, 4000 years before Christ, was navigation an issue there, or were they mostly focused on timekeeping, or was navigation already a big issue there with knowing about Polaris and how to find a north? Or
Well, one important thing is that Polaris has been the pole stars only during the last centuries. It was actually Christopher Columbus, when traveling to America, when he noticed that the pole star was moving around the pole. Actually, it was not fixed there. Okay? Early on, there were other stars closer to the pole. For example, during Roman times, the star closest to the pole was Kochab, which is Beta Ursa Majoris. In Egyptian times, it was Tuban, Alpha Draconis. So the pole star has changed so much that the oldest references we have in navigation usually relate to constellations. And the most far away we can move on with that is with the Odyssey and the Iliad, especially in the Odyssey. The Big Dipper is mentioned as a reference to follow when you want to go, when Ulysses is traveling back to Ithaca, he is told by Kirke to always keep Eliche, which is the name in that time of the Big Dipper, to keep it to his left, so that he will always navigate towards the east, you see. And this is one of the earliest references. We know that the Phoenicians, more or less in the same epoch, used the Little Dipper to navigate across the Mediterranean. And not all the navigations of the Phoenicians were of cabotage, I mean, close to the coast. For example, when they traveled from the south of Greece to Malta and Sicily, they had to cross a large section of the Mediterranean without having a land reference. And almost certainly at that moment, they guide by the stars. We know that the Polynesians used the star to colonize the whole Pacific. We know it because the tradition has survived until our days. But the colonization of the Pacific by the Polynesians is quite late. It is a phenomenon of the last 2,000, maybe 3,000 years ago. So for 4,000 BC, as you asked, there is hardly any reference anywhere that may talk about navigations, high sea navigations, without looking at the coast nearby. For certain, they should have navigated. The megalithic phenomena which spread from the southeast of the Iberian, from southwest of the Iberian Peninsula to Scandinavia, with such sort of very similar megalithic monuments, possibly could span by the sea. But I think that most of them were cabotage navigations. We cannot prove that they observed the stars to go deep into the sea without looking at land, at the coast nearby. We are not sure of that. But of course, we have historical, clear examples of the use of stars for navigations in the sea. In the Western culture, at least from 3,000 years ago, and in Polynesia, more or less from the same epoch. And even the use of stars for navigation in Earth. We know, for example, that the Arabs, in the frankincense route that crosses Arabia, from Arabia Felix, what today is Yemen, to the Mediterranean coast and Egypt, they use Canopus, which they call Suhail, the second brightest star of the sky, to guide the caravans across the Arabian Peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
So the star has been used, but so ancient references, we are not sure at all about it.
There is a you mentioned Canopus, and I take it that we have talked about it before that Sirius was at least during some centuries of Egypt an orientation point that was important, and there is some reference that Canopus was the opposite reference point. Is there a connection in the between Canopus and Sirius within history?
Well, Sirius, as you know, was the personification of the goddess Sopdet, which was a form of Isis.
Mm-hmm.
The first mention to this star, we have it in the pyramid tests, which are dated to the end of the 5th dynasty, so already 4,200 years ago, more or less. And we know that the Egyptians observed Sirius because it was the herald of the flooding, of the inundation of the Nile. The heliacal rising of Sopdet marked the arriving of the growing waters from the south that will cover the whole of Egypt, will fertilize the land, and will make Egypt. So Sirius was very, very important, and it was a personification of one of the most important Egyptian goddesses. About Canopus, there has always been doubts about it. For example, in the famous Denderah zodiac, Canopus is possibly identified as a form of the god Horus, as a son of Isis and Osiris, okay? But this is very, very late in Egyptian history. We had found strong evidences that early on, Canopus was a reference for gods that were somehow related to Osiris.
Mm-hmm.
So, although normally Osiris is associated to Sah, to the constellation Sah, which we believe is part of our constellation of Orion, there are some hints that also Canopus form a sort of triad with Sirius and Orion. What exactly this work in early pharaonic times, we do not know. But there are strong evidences that some important temples, like for example, the temple of Herishev in Heracleopolis Magna, or the temple of the Oasis of Siwa, the famous oracle temple where Alexander the Great traveled to be recognized as a son of Zeus Ammon. And even the southern axis of the large Kaknat temple can be connected to the orientation to orientations to the star Canopus. Mm-hmm. But this is still something that needs to be clarified. I mean, I'm confident on our results and the ideas of some other peoples who have worked on that, but we are not 100% sure, as we are, for example, in the case of Sirius.
How difficult is it to, if you are studying the texts and if you are studying the descriptions, to have a distinct meaning for, let's say, Sah or Sopdet or Sopdu to a star? Because let's think of biblical stories where you have a complex term like Trinity, where there is layers put on top of layers and different meanings depending on how you talk about it. Is it even possible to say, yep, that was Osiris and Osiris is Orion? Or is it even shifting during a year or a cycle that they are interchangeable or mixing figures?
Actually, in the oldest text where we have stellar references, which are the pyramid tests, as I mentioned before, There are clear mention to both Sopdet and Sah. They are considered like a sort of couple, okay? And they are the parents of the renovated pharaoh as a star. And normally this star is Horus, Horus of the morning, which several Egyptologists today agree that this is a form of the planet Venus.
Mm-hmm.
Now we know, for example, that the god Horus, which at the beginning of Egyptian history was the patron god of royalty. Actually, the first name of the pharaohs were not inscribed within a cartouche. They
Mm-hmm.
were in a serech coronated by the falcon god, by Horus.
Mm-hmm.
This falcon god was almost certainly Venus. We have no doubts that Sopdet is Sirius. Regarding Sah, we are not exactly sure if the constellation of Orion as we see it today was exactly the constellation Sah of the ancient Egyptians. Actually, I do not believe so. Mm-hmm. I think that, for example, the three stars of the belt of Orion were not the belt of Osiris, let's say, of Sah, but actually were the head of the deity.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
You see?
Mm-hmm.
This
that means that they would have been a crown of...
Actually, there is a Sah in some very ancient circles is plot with a crown over his head, which is the representation of his hieroglyphic name, which has three bands. That's a colleague of mine, Kurloja, several years ago identified as the three stars of the belt of Orion. Mm-hmm. And I think that he can be correct. If this is true, this will leave free another very bright star in the surroundings, mm-hmm. which is Betelgeuse. Okay. Mm-hmm. If Sah is not the whole of Orion, but only the southern part of Orion, extending to Lepus, to the constellation which is just below, and this works very well with the decans and with the Ramessid star clocks, then you have Betelgeuse exactly forming a triangle with Rigel and with Sirius. Mm-hmm. And then Betelgeuse, in that case, could be a form of Horus also. This could be Horus-Sopdu. Mm-hmm. So the Horus, which is in Sopdet. But as I mentioned before, there is the Egyptian religious text is not an astronomical manual. You see?
Yeah.
Where you can, this is this, this is this, this is this. There can be multiple interpretations. So in some way, it is clear that Horus, Dua, Seba, so Horus, the star in the morning, is Venus, for certainty. But there are some other cases in which the texts speak about a Horus-Sopdu that seems to be a star. This could be, and only could be related to Betelgeuse, which is the only other first magnitude star which is in the surroundings, you see. Or, as I said before, it could even be Canopus, but we are not sure about it. Because in the Dendera zodiac, Canopus seems to be related to a form of Horus. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that the Egyptians never were so clear in this is this, this is this, this is this, you see? For example, the three outer planets, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter, all the three of them were personification of Horus, mm-hmm. at least from the New Kingdom onwards. We know because of the astronomical ceilings, starting by the one of Senemu. So normally, Egyptian astral deities are polyvalent in some way, you see. And we cannot be certainly sure 100% that this is this, that is that, because it is impossible to know it with precision.
If you simplify the characters of the Osiris myth, maybe you could correct me there. I will very much simplify now. You have Osiris, which is the old king. You have Isis, which is the queen. And then you have Horus, which is the sun. But then you also have...
Horus is not the sun.
Okay.
Horus is never the sun.
How is he in connection?
Ra-Horathki is the sun. But this is not Horus. I mean, Archaeoastronomy, so Horus, son of Isis, has nothing to do with the sun.
Okay.
You see, this is something that confuses a lot of people. Horus is not the sun. The sun is Ra, okay? And it has three personalities, which are Khepri at dawn, Ra-Horathki at midday, and then Atum at dusk, okay? But it's not Horus at all. So the sun is not a son of, actually, Ra is the father of the goddess of the Nead, including Isis and Osiris.
Okay.
Is that, well, the father, the father of the father of the father, because you have Ra, which created Shu after and Tefnut, then Shu after Nut created Nut and Geb, and then Nut and Geb had the five sons of Nut, the five siblings of Nut, which are Isis, Osiris, Nephthys, Seth, and Haroeris, a no form of Horus. But Ra, the sun, is not Horus at all. You see?
Okay.
And then you have Archaeoastronomy, who is the son of Horus and the son of Isis and Osiris. This is something I understand, because this is an error that a lot of people has in mind, that Horus is a form of the sun, and it is not, okay? Actually, the pharaohs were the Horus on earth, and at least since the reign of Yadafre, the eldest son of Hufu, we know that they were called Sah-Re, so son of the sun. You cannot be the sun and the son of the sun at once, you see.
Is that, now we have Seth also, and could he be this? I know that he's not with negative qualities, perhaps, but is he sort of the bad guy, or the villain, or chaos, or has he another role to play?
Well, actually, we know that at least from the New Kingdom onwards, Seth is a form of the planet Mercury, okay? And Rolf Krauss, one of the most prominent Egyptologists still alive, produced a very nice book several years ago, making an astronomical interpretation of the pyramid test, in which he argued that the fight between Horus and Seth can be interpreted as the fight between Venus and Mercury in looking at the horizon, the movements that both planets make just after sunset, okay? He interpreted them as a sort of dance, let's say, as a sort of fight between Horus and Seth. So Seth apparently is a representation of the planet Mercury in the very beginning of Egyptian history. The problem of the myth, that as we know it, is that it comes from Plutarch. It means this is 2,000 years after the pyramid test. Okay? So you can imagine, just think of Christianity, okay? In the last 2,000 years, we have had so many heresies, so many disputes. I mean, we Catholics believe that the Virgin Mary not only is the mother of Jesus, but also the mother of God. And we believe that she was immaculate, okay? The Protestants do not think that she has any special role, and they even believe that Jesus has son, brother and sisters, son and daughters of Mary. So you imagine just Christianity. So imagine 2,000 years of evolution of Egyptian religion. We cannot think of Egypt as an static culture in which, if this is so in 2500 BC, you will have the same in Plutarch times more than 2,000 years later. So stories evolved, you see? This is the question. For example, in the Middle Kingdom, there were no problem at all of representing Seth and Horus uniting the two lands for the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. At that moment, Seth, of course, was not evil at all. It was possibly later on, when Seth was assimilated with Baal, the god of the Hyksos, that Seth took this ugly, let's say, role in Egyptian religion, but possibly not earlier, you see. We don't know for certain, but possibly not earlier.
Is there, I mean, there is this, this possibility, let's say this, to view at this dynamic between those two as order and chaos. And if we talk about the Christian and the Catholic view, you also have this story dynamic of order and chaos. Could it be a possibility that the idea of Lucifer as the fallen one, so to say, as the one fallen from order, could have been evolved from Seth? Or is there too much in the middle to speculate about that?
Well, there is too much in the middle to speculate about that.
Damn.
Actually think of the name Lucifer. What does it mean, Lucifer? The making of light, the maker of light. So for certain, Lucifer at the beginning was some sort of celestial object of some sort. There are some colleagues that argue that Lucifer is actually a form of the planet Venus. So who knows? What is certain is that the cult of the Virgin Mary rised among strongest in Egypt. Actually, as you know, for example, the Coptic church is monophysist. They are monophysicists. For them, there is no human personality in Jesus. So Mary is Theotokos, the mother of God. Okay. Could this be a relationship of that with Horus and Isis? Of course, I'm certain that the representations of Horus as a child with Isis in late Egyptian iconography strongly influenced the iconography of Mary and the child, for certain. I have no doubt about it. If any other aspect was included of Egyptian mythology in Christianity, we cannot be sure for certain. Christianity drank of Mithraism. For example, Christmas. It drank of ancient Jewish traditions. It possibly drank also of ancient Egyptian traditions. It drank of paganism, Greco-Roman paganism. So in some way, it's such a pastiche, an impressive pastiche. Actually, I love it in that sense. From the cultural point of view, is really magic.
Yeah.
To study all these things. So we cannot, we should not look for a single origin in ancient Egypt.
Now there is this one story about Isis, which has a sort of Marian quality to it, let's say, where she is walking out of the river, or she is born out of foam, and she is seeking refuge because she is hunted by Seth. And
yes,
there is in the text it says, I think, that she is accompanied by 7 scorpions. Now, is the number 7? It's very often an interesting number, let's say, if the 7 comes up. Do you know any reference of 7 within this whole story complex of Isis or Osiris, or?
Not exactly. I can tell you where the 7 come from. I mean, the 7 comes from the 7 planets of antiquity, almost for certain. Actually, the Pleiades also were identified as 7, when normally, if you count them, if you have a very good eye, you can count as much as 9. And if you have a very poor eye, it is very difficult to see the 7th. So the number 7 was some kind of magic. And I'm almost certain that it has strong connections with the planets visible to naked eye, that were later related to the 7 days of the week, of course, and like that they have arrived until today, or to us. I mean, in the Latin languages of Europe, or apart from Sunday, that we call Dominus, Dies Dominicus, so Lord's Day. Most of the rest are clearly associated with the planets: the Moon, Mars, Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter. So, and I think that the 7 comes from that, and it has possibly an origin in the Middle East, almost for certain.
Now, I would maybe to give you a last question for this conversation. I wanted to ask you from a point of an astronomer, if you had one wish, a genie in the bottle that you can ask, what question would you burn to have answered, which there is right now no idea how to answer, or a mystery that is a blind spot right now?
Well, can I use my other aspect as an exoplanetologist to answer that question, or should I restrict to archaeoastronomy?
No, please go for the exoplanet.
Well, I have been teaching now astrobiology for nearly a decade at the university since I started researching exoplanets at the turn of the century. And of course, the big question is to find an Earth 2.0. So an exoplanet where a copy of the Earth close enough to have life, and that we should be able to find it, you see? Because this can be very important to understand how lives evolve in the universe. We still are alone from that point of view. So the question is, are we alone in the universe? And this question, I think, can only be solved through advances in exoplanetology. I would be very happy if we are able to solve that question in my lifespan. But this is what I was expecting 20 years ago. I'm not sure if I will be able to survive another 20 years. But this would be This will be the genius in the bottle right now from my research and for my teaching. And from the archaeoastronomical point of view, I have so many answers I would like to, so many questions I would like to answer, that I am not sure which one I will solve, I will prefer. But from the point of view of an exoplanetologist, it is quite easy.
Well, actually, we had now such a long and great conversation about the cultural astronomies that all the questions I have prepared for the exoplanets, maybe we could save it up for a second conversation, because I think that will be another completely long conversation.
Could be.
I would be very happy for that. And yeah, maybe for this conversation, if I can thank you very much for your time and for your sharing of this topic and enthusiasm, and thank you very much for joining and doing this.
For you, Matthias, this has been a really nice conversation. I have enjoyed quite a lot, very much, I would say.
Thank you very much.